remember
about your first encounter with Walter or his work? What were your initial impressions?
Well, thank you, Christine, for inviting me and including me on this wonderful panel in honor of Walter, whom I deeply loved and am so grateful for. And not just Walter, but this whole institution deeply, profoundly impacted my life. So I'm very thankful to be back on campus and among you. And I went to Columbia the year Walter retired. So he didn't go far. He stuck around the whole time I was here, but he wasn't officially on the faculty after my first year. And so Bill Brown knows something about how when you try to retire, Columbia gives you more work to do. And so Walter taught the introduction that Christine and Kathleen had been teaching together for a long time. He was tasked with teaching, which maybe is from the videos out there might be from that class. But anyway, so my first impression of Walter, whom I did not know much about before coming to seminary. I didn't know much of anything before coming to seminary. and was to sit there for a prayer from Walter, from the lectern, where he prayed like no one I had ever been around. And the you who, blah, blah, and then it was just all this poetic. So I was like looking around at people while they had their heads down. You know, I was like, does anybody else hear how this guy's praying? Because I've never heard anybody pray like that. And just being, like you said, captivated by him in the classroom. And from there, my life set off on a different trajectory.
I guess I have a little bit of a similar story. I came to Columbia totally clueless. I had a chemical engineering degree from Clemson University in a vague sense, go Tigers, in a vague sense that I felt God calling me to something. I grew up in a church that was all about God is love, which I'm grateful for. And sometime in college, I guess I started feeling the injustices of the world and being drawn especially toward homeless communities. But I couldn't put all that together. So when I got here, I had no idea who Walter was, never heard of him. I remember in Greek school, chapel, somebody in a hushed tone was like, "That's Walter Brueggemann." But I was like, great, I don't know who he is. But I had the incredible good fortune of when I came here, there was a class called Baptism and Evangelical Calling. And Walter was my professor for baptism and evangelical calling. And that class was about how when you are baptized, you are set apart to live a different kind of life that is in contradistinction to the life of the empire. Right up Walter's alley, right? And I heard him, and it spoke to something deep inside me. He would say things like, "The acids of modernity are dissolving your brain." I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded really great. And so I was hooked, and so I started taking as many classes as I could.
So for me, it was 2001, and I was in Virginia Beach. I was teaching algebra at Frank W. Cox High School in Virginia Beach. I was just out of college. I had really no idea what I was going to do with my life, and I was volunteering at a youth group, like teaching Bible study for high school kids. And one of the kids said, "Hey, could you teach about Genesis?" So I said, "Okay." So I went to the Barnes & Noble bookstore at Hilltop, the shopping center in Virginia Beach, and I went to the shelves, and the first thing I picked out, thank God, was this. It was Brueggemann's Genesis. I had no idea who he was, never heard of him. I open it up, and I start reading the introduction, and it says, "The exposition of Genesis comes out of the church and is addressed to the church. For that reason, we may structure our interpretation according to the statement of faith of the United Church of Christ." And he pulls two little phrases out of it. It says, "God calls the worlds into being, and God calls us into the church." And then he says, "The two calls must be taken together. Neither may be taken alone nor subsumed by the other. The two calls together affirm that God has formed the world to be God's world, to be a special community, and to be God's witness. This is the same God that calls the world and who calls this special community." And I read that and I said, I want to read more of that. And so I sat there and I read the rest of the commentary in the little coffee shop at the Barnes & Noble, and they kicked me out at the end of the day. And about a year later, this came out, On to Heaven, Rooted to Earth, and a friend had this on his desk in Virginia Beach, and I picked it up and I just started reading it, and I read, "Our lives are occupied territory, occupied by a cacophony of voices, and the din undoes us." In the daytime, we have no time to listen, beset as we are by anxiety and goals and assignments and work. And in the night, the voices are so confusing, we can hardly sort out what could possibly be your voice. I mean, it captured me, and I said, this is what I want to do. And so for me, this was a formative moment for wanting to be a biblical scholar.
That's great. Judy. I first met or encountered Walter Brueggemann through his work. I was in seminary, and I'm trying to get the historical reconstruction right here. I think it was probably somewhere at the end of my first year or second year. My seminary experience early on was heavy on historical criticism. And because I wanted to do well in school, I did what I was asked to do. But it meant that as a student, I was compartmentalized and kind of disassociating a little bit. I couldn't make sense of how what I was learning connected to where I came from. Somehow I was assigned the prophetic imagination, and I brought it because on the inside in pencil it says $5.95. Just think back to when that was. And in it is my pink highlighter. The experience of reading this book gave me the sense that there was room. That there was going to be room for me in the academy, that there was going to be room for me as a biblical scholar, that there was someone out there who was doing critical work of Bible and reading it closely at the same time, and being deeply theological and not afraid of the Holy Spirit and caring about church folk. I hadn't yet gotten into womanist thought. That wasn't something that was offered early on in my seminary career, but we got there. My point is, here was someone with a German name, because almost everyone had German names. So I didn't pay attention to another guy with a beard with a German name. But this guy with the German name opened up some possibilities to me, for which I'm grateful.
So I'm older than everybody in the room, and therefore, when I went to Princeton Seminary, we were doing historical critical method, which was, I don't know why, I stuck through it. I went there to work with Bernard Anderson, who had gone to school with Walter Brueggemann, and they were both interested in the books as literature. But it didn't show up in my graduate studies much at all. And anyway, I got through it all and graduated, and then through a friend named Louis Stolman, some of you may know him, Old Testament scholar, I was working in Jeremiah, and he started a program in the Society of Biblical Literature for people to talk about new ways of thinking about the book of Jeremiah. So we kept inviting Walter because he had already written his commentary on Jeremiah, and he changed the SBL. Partly, if he was speaking, the place was packed, which is what we wanted, and it was packed also because he was arguing somewhat violently with some of his colleagues. So I knew Walter that way. I got to know Walter personally the year he was president of the Society of Biblical Literature. And he had published a commentary, he had published a review on 3 commentaries, really critical, historical critical commentaries on Jeremiah, and it was in the Journal for the Study of Old Testament, not CPQ, which I thought. And he describes these 3 famous scholars and all the work they've done, how they're alike and how they're different. And he ends it with, the church deserves more. So I went over and I said, thank you so much for your commentary review. I completely agree with you. I love it. And he said, well, you're probably the only person in the Society of Biblical Literature. He was under a lot of attack for that. And I think that's how I eventually got a job at Columbia Seminary, because he and I were concerned for the same thing, which I think everybody on this panel is, how the text addresses the world, the people of faith, the church. So, one more thing. I taught at a Catholic school of foreign mission. And what I was doing was teaching Walter Brueggemann's prophetic imagination. And then I came to Columbia Seminary, and I could no longer teach it because he was in the next room. Excuse me for talking so long.
So the year was 1987, and I was a lowly graduate student at Emory University, first year, in Old Testament studies, and I had just become active at North Decatur Presbyterian Church. And Walter had been invited to lead a Lenten series on the Book of Psalms. And I was a little bit aware of Walter's work, particularly on the Psalms, but I never met him personally. I'd never heard him. This was before I could go to SBL. And so I was there, there at North Decatur Pres on one Wednesday evening, the first week of Lent. And he came in, and he just sort of sucked the oxygen out of the room. He had this very commanding presence, and he started teaching, and I had never witnessed a Bible lecture as performance art before. With dynamic gesturing and his growling resonant voice, and his hands on his head, bopping himself on the head, all the classic Brueggemann mannerisms. And so that was just so engaging, so enthralling. And then he said something that just floored me. He was talking about the Psalms, of course, and he referred to a particular psalm as demonic. And I thought, whoa, can you say that? And for the life of me, I can't remember which psalm it was.
There's one out there.
There's one guy
That was 40 years ago. I have my suspicions. It may have been one of the imperialistic royal psalms like Psalm 2 or 110. He may have been referring to Psalm 137. But in any case, I thought, whoa, he's just blowing me out of the water. And I'm a first-year grad student in Old Testament studies. And then what I found most helpful is that he invited us, after he talked about the Psalms of Lament, to write a lament from the perspective of a Palestinian mother. That was 40 years ago, and that has always stuck with me.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. Bill's last comment transitions us well to the next question, which is directed to the two students on the panel of Walter, to Davis and to Bobby. What was Walter like as a teacher? What do you recall about being a student in his classroom? You've spoken a little bit about this, but there's more to say, I suspect. And we'll start with Bobby this time.
Oh, okay. All right. I like the way you said that, Bill, of biblical lecture as dramatic performance or whatever. Walter was big in the classroom and lots of energy. And if you ever studied with Walter, he does rhetorical analysis, and he scribbles on the board in this crazy handwriting the passage he's working on, and he circles and circles and draws lines, and he's like, there, that's how the text works. And it totally makes sense. But one of the things I remember is one paper I wrote, we had to do our own rhetorical analyses, and so I was like, I'm going to draw one like Walter, and so I wrote one, and it was like, and he wrote a little note at the top that says, this should be more neat. Are you kidding me right now? Anyway, so he was very big on the board. He was known for this thing called the arc dance that was when he was teaching 2 Samuel 5, and it would be like the way that David danced. I forget exactly how it went, but it involved sort of being like this and like dancing a little. And so everybody would, the upper class students would be like, hey, has he done the arc dance yet?
Yeah.
He would. I remember he liked to scratch his head this way, and he had these. He would talk to you with his glasses, and they were half glasses. You can see him in the video out there, and he would look at you over the half glasses, like when he was making a point. And he told me the story that one of his kids, I think it was, said, "Dad, they make glasses that cover your whole your whole eye." And he said, "These glasses are not to correct my vision. These glasses are a pedagogical device." So he was something, and I was, to be honest, I was always a little intimidated by Walter, like in the good way, but I didn't want to make a mistake in front of Walter. And if you asked him a question, he would come back with these really beautiful responses, and he would always end them with, "Do you want to come back at that?" And which was it was an invitation from him to engage, but for me, I was always like, no, I do not. I don't want to come back at that. One of the other things I remember about Walter is he graded at a furious pace. This is my memory. I don't know. You know how memory can be. In my January term of my first year, I had a Psalms class in January, and it lasted from, I don't know, like 9 to 11:30. And there were 30 students in that class, and we all turned in a paper at 11:30. And when we went to check our mail at the end of the day at like 4 o'clock, our papers were graded with comments all back in our box. And it was like, I don't know how he did it, but his handwriting was such that you couldn't read what he wrote on it. But he wrote all his books longhand, and so he had an administrative assistant at the time named Tempe Alexander, I think was her name. And she could read his handwriting because he wrote all his books longhand and gave them to her to type. And so we would all sneak into her office and ask if she could translate the on the paper. But Walter was, even though he intimidated me, he was so generous and with his time and with his interest in our work. I remember in that same Psalms class, one day he invited me to teach one of the Psalms, like get up in front of the class and like work it out on the board and like teach it. And it wasn't something he invited just everybody to do, but it was like he saw something in me even though I was a first-year seminary student, and he thought I could do something that I didn't think I could do. And so he trusted me to teach his class one day for part of the time. And so he was always doing things like that made you, even as big as he was, you felt connected to him.
Yeah, that's a lot of, I resonate with that deeply. One thing about Walter's teaching also was that he never just taught the Old Testament, he always taught all of the disciplines at the seminary and more. You learned as much about, no offense to any of the faculty in here, pastoral care, Christian education, Christian theology, New Testament. You learned more about...
Literature.
I'm really offending some people now.
Not as much.
You learned as much about other disciplines. He was never one to just take on a topic from a single disciplinary standpoint, and he was always trying to draw connections between what we were reading in the text and not just the life of the church, but also other disciplinary tools that people, he himself had multiple terminal degrees. While he was dean, he got a doctorate in education. So, I mean, he knew about different disciplines, and he knew how helpful they could be, and he worked harder than anyone I've known at drawing connections among them. And the other thing that many people have said, but just his profound eloquence and the way his brain worked to draw connections among things that other people just don't see and don't make. And he would always take a topic that you might think, well, this is this side of that issue and this is that side of the same issue. And he would rearrange things to where you were like, well, both those sides are wrong. And here's this other side I never knew existed. And now all of a sudden I'm thinking deeper and in more healthy ways about social issues and church issues. And he was just someone who always, you said, took the air out of the room, Bill, I think is what you said.
Something just fell over.
The ghost of Walter.
That's that demon psalm. that's what's going on out there.
It's the ghost of Walter.
Somebody's reading the wrong psalm. But at a personal level, I would feel like every class would end, and that was the first time I had breathed since the prayer at the beginning.
Yeah.
So same kind of thing, but at a different. Okay, now I've got all this to think about and work through, and part of it was just how much he made you believe that the Bible really matters.
Yep.
It really, really matters what we're doing with the Bible, and if we're not getting in there and speaking Bible, he didn't write English or speak English. He kind of spoke Bible, the language that he used, and he made us believe that profound theological insight and deep social critique and psychological insight into who we are psychologically, sociologically, socially, and then as people of faith, reading this old ancient text. And he was very careful and he was very generous, and he would invite students to lunch and dinner, and he was always open to speak if you were to just drop in on him. And anyway, he was incredibly generous with his time, and that is probably what mattered most to me. But of course, it goes along with the pyrotechnics and the performative the acting and also the stand-up comedy. He was a very funny man, and he loved jokes and he loved to laugh, and so I love that about him too.
Thank you both very much. Kathleen, we'll pivot from being a student to being a colleague.
Okay.
What was it like to be Walter's Old Testament?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to Columbia Seminary for holding this event and for giving me time during the day the past couple of weeks to be thinking about how grateful I am to Walter Brueggemann and for the opportunity to teach here with him. I'd like to start by saying it's obvious this man had an incredible integrative intelligence. He was so smart. But everybody who does Old Testament studies is very smart. Don't you think? You have to learn a lot of stuff. Okay. But what he did, what he had that the average bear doesn't have, discipline and devotion. He had both of them in the extreme. Well, I don't know extreme. His vocation was center of his life. It was vocation of academic work that was to meet the church and the needs of the people. Now, here's how it manifested itself to colleagues who were sitting next to him in the offices up on the 3rd floor of Harrington Center. He would be there. It didn't matter what time you got there, he was already there. And what he was doing was not grading or figuring out what he was going to say to the students in front of him. He was reading and he was writing. He wrote for an hour and a half every morning. Christine and I would be coming in at the last minute trying to prepare for the students we were going to be facing shortly. That was all we thought about, those faces in front of us. He was working on the work that fed him. And he did it every single day. And to me, it's a lesson in discipline and devotion. And he did it because he was devoted to the work and he loved the work, but he was devoted to the church. So I have about 4 pages here on this little card that I want to talk about. He was writing something. He would encourage us all. He would encourage all his colleagues. I think Lee is going to agree with that, and maybe you are too. I'm not sure. He encouraged us in every way possible. And he did it partly by handing us books to read or articles. And did that to the whole faculty. If you mentioned something, he sent you an article about it. He wrote you a note about it. And this is extraordinary energy. It's extraordinary care. Where I'd be trying to think, what am I going to cook for dinner? There he was doing this. He was doing this. He was... well, I guess we both learned pretty quickly we were not going to be Walter Brueggemann no matter what we did. That was a relief to realize that we didn't have to do that. And then students would come along, and we might have our doors open to welcome students to us, and his door would be closed, and they would come to us and say, "Is Walter in?" And Christine would say, "Well, you could find out if you knocked on the door." A lot of the first students were intimidated by him. Okay, I want to say something personal. He and I had some disagreements about God, in particular whether God is an abusive God. And his conversation with Dr. Blumenthal, the rabbi at Emory, you probably had him, Old Testament scholar, he agreed with him that the biblical text presents us with an abusive God. And I said, I wrote this, if God is abusive, get me out of here. There's nowhere anybody who's ever been abused, any people who've been abused, can live. And we really disagreed about this. It was, of course, pleasant, but it wasn't, it was tense. And then somehow that led me to trauma studies. And trauma studies helped me think about why people talk about God as punishing and vengeful and destructive. Helped me think about that. And I did a little article about this, and I showed it to him, and he said, "I am envious because this opens the whole book of Jeremiah in a new way." Now, I'm just a scared little person, and I'll tell you that was the push, that was the help to me for my own work, my own small work. And he was so generous about this that I guess we've used that word a lot. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, I think that's all I want to say right now about working with him, laughing. We laughed a lot.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to start with Judy. What do you appreciate about Walter's work over the years, and how has that shaped your scholarship and teaching? However you want to engage the themes.
In 20 minutes or less.
So I want to celebrate the way Walter Brueggemann delighted in Scripture. So much of the academy, as I experienced it, was rigid and exacting and don't make a mistake. And, there was a lot of effort and energy into getting it right. And then here comes this guy, and he's brilliant like everybody else, but he's having fun. He is modeling a way of engaging the text that is so formative for us. And I hope that we all got the message. Scripture is messy, and Scripture is difficult and challenging, and it can be a joyous experience. So I've heard this wonder thing going around. I mean, there's a lot of godly play that's being channeled in this, giving people permission to ask questions of the text, which I think helps us with difficult texts. We don't feel like we have to get it right, but we get involved. And I appreciate the way he had a preacher's ear. He's working on a text, but he's thinking about what a preacher's going to do with that text. And I'm grateful for that. And the other thing I want to say that I appreciate is when we talk about generosity. So I encountered Walter Brueggemann through his books. I would go to SBL. I'd see him up there on the panel. I knew who he was. Maybe one day I asked him a question. I don't know. I would have, blanked out or something. But when I finally had a chance to work with him, he was so kind to me. He treated me like we were peers, me and Walter. And it was really, really lovely. And I will always remember that, the way he listened to what I said and asked thoughtful questions. It is my hope and prayer that those of us who have the privilege of having this kind of education would find enough space to be gracious. To be gracious. Wow. It just would change the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Brennan.
Thanks. There are so many things to say, but let me say this. So, Old Testament studies, was one of the epicenters of the Enlightenment. So from 1780 to 1820, everyone in Germany was doing Old Testament studies. I don't know why. I've read books about this. No, really, it's a really interesting, strange thing and very contingent thing. It didn't have to be that way, but it was really the epicenter of Enlightenment thought. And there was it was a space where people argued about what truth is and how you do historical work and what true history is and what is not history. And of course, there's just there's books, whole books written on this. Michael Legaspi's book on Marcellus. It's called the Death of Scripture and the Rise of Biblical Studies. Really fascinating book about this time period. And we are still living in a world shaped deeply by that. So if you go to SBL or whatever, you're often go to papers that are just about philology. That's it, or just about historical critical work. And that's what Walter called these the strong men of biblical studies, and they go and they fight each other on what this whatever the archaeological things it means or what this word means, etc. And he was never quite interested in that, but also he did not do the other move, which was the just purely devotional move, which is to say this 100% identification with what you already see in the text that justifies your faith or in some way speaks to you personally. Which those are kind of the two paths in a way that you can see in Western culture, especially. And what grabbed me immediately about Walter's work when I picked up the commentary, but also through his theology book, which I did not bring because it's so huge it wouldn't fit on the plane. But what I loved about his theology book when I picked it up, the Theology of the Old Testament, is that he didn't do the thing where he said, "Hey, there's just no theology here. There's just not. This is just a bunch of ancient stuff that got stuck together somehow, and so let's just dissect this dead body of text." But he also didn't say, this thing is exactly what I thought it would be when I opened it up, and tells me everything that I always thought I should be told, and it tells me the creed exactly how I see it. He does this kind of brave maneuver, which is to say he takes very seriously the, historical nature of the text and thinks philologically about it, and notices when there are dissonances in the text and names those things. But then he also says, I just trust that this thing is somehow speaking to our faith. And he does this dialectical move with it. And so you read the theology and he's like, there's this testimony where God is good and God is great. And then he also this counter testimony where God is really mean sometimes. And God seems like God hurt me, and God did some things that I can't even understand, I can't contemplate. And this is the counter testimony. And really, in a way, our life is moving between this testimony and counter testimony, and God is in the middle of all of it. And God wants us to, in fact, be bold enough to speak our mind, and when we feel hurt, or so that giving you, as Judy said, permission to say these things that might have sounded scandalous in both contexts, in both historical critical contexts, as if the Bible speaks to me, and in a faith context, as if the Bible might in some way validate my feelings of hurt when I confront God. And so all to say that I think is something that has deeply shaped the way I even think about being a biblical scholar.
Thank you.
Yeah. What has been said is so true about Walter. He made the text fun. He made the text profound. There was sort of a participatory hermeneutic about Walter that I'm not sure if anybody else has really captured so intensely as he has in his writings and in his teaching. What has always impressed me is, as others have noted, he is a quintessential interdisciplinarian when it comes to working with the text. And he summarized that with two words that he gave when he was here years ago as part of a alumni event. He said, "I aspire to be an agile exegete." And that is to say, Walter was the very model of a modern agile exegete. And that agility included not only conversing with the text, but conversing with voices from culture, from history, theological, psychological, sociological. It was everything. It was everything that he was conversant with. He was as much a voracious reader as he was a prolific writer. Yeah. And that's what made him stand out. It almost as if, as you take a look at all of his works accumulatively, and I want to give a shout out to Bobby Williamson's wonderful new book coming out, Reading the Bible with Brueggemann. He does a masterful overview from his early works to some of his most recent works. And then he provides at the end a chapter on how Walter dealt with criticism of his work. And you bring in a little bit of your critical work as well, as part of the ongoing dialogue with Walter's work. It's just brilliant. And so a shout out to that. But I thought one thing, Walter's breadth is staggering. His canonical breadth, Old Testament, New Testament. And I've always felt that Walter left no stone unturned. And then I thought, maybe there is one stone he has not turned yet. And so I started looking that up. And it's an interest of mine that I'm just beginning to pursue, and that is, what does Walter have anything to say about aesthetics and beauty? And I haven't found too much in his published work, but a shout out to our archivists at the John Bulow Campbell Library, and particularly to Michael Robertson, who dug up a series of lectures from 2006 that he gave to the Center of Spirituality at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Colorado, entitled A Remembered Beauty, in which he talks about aesthetics and lifts up certain texts about beauty, particularly creation, the tabernacle, and the temple, and how each of these sections of the biblical canon are remembered by people in exile. And It's a very poignant. It's four lectures that he gave, most of them undecipherable with his handwriting. But I was able to find out, I was able to decipher one sentence, which has stood out to me. I think it reads this way. And it's about the exiles remembering the tabernacle in the context of exile, and imagining what it would be like to have the tabernacle constructed in the state of Babylonian exile. And he says, in the shitty environment of exile, here stands beauty. But then it could also be read, in the shabby environment of exile, here stands beauty. So I need to consult with those who can decipher it. I want to get it right, but I'm willing to stand with either translation. But in terms of aesthetics, I had learned from Tia that he was a lover of jazz and of Tchaikovsky, and particularly his Symphony No. 5, which is big and bold. And I think what I appreciated about his journey of scholarship and writing and ministry is that what he was doing was improvising and doing it with boldness. He was always improvising familiar themes and pushing them in new directions, and particularly as he was engaged in critical conversations with colleagues and such. So I really admire him for that, his interdisciplinary, his integrative, what do you call it? His integrative intelligence. Yeah.
Put it all together.
Yeah, putting it all together. He always had. He could see the big picture. He never lost sight of the forest from the trees. Yeah. And part of that forest was, as Brennan has pointed out, these tectonic tensions in the canon about defining God and life and worship and the like. And even in the core testimony, there is this tension within God, this disjunction in the very heart of God. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the finally comes the poet.
Yeah.
If that's related to your aesthetic concern, because he was looking at the texts not as historical reports, but as poetry that shaped thinking and life. And I wonder if you could.
Yeah, so, right. In fact, I think his basic approach to aesthetics is that in a culture of dominant ideology, art will always be subversive.
Yeah. Even to this day.
Royal leaders find art to be subversive, and artists need to be pushed out of society because they hold the truth that is for freedom. And so he always begins with that's there, and finally comes the poet. But he's never, as far as I can tell, he's never really talked about the discipline of aesthetics and what he means by beauty until these lectures, which I'm trying to figure out.
Davis, would you want to speak to the question? Do you remember the question? Should I
No.
rephrase it? What do you appreciate about Walter's work over the years, and how has it informed your scholarship and or your teaching?
Well, I think I have to say pretty much what other people have said, and but what's probably most profoundly impacted me in that regard is how deeply read he was in psychoanalysis and sociology. And bringing those two fields together from the social sciences and thinking deeply about what is a healthy, what is a healthy psyche, and what is a healthy social, environment, and what if you have an unhealthy social environment, and what if you have unhealthy psychological, and then thinking about the Bible in relation to all that in the church. And I think that those are the big. I don't want to label things with big names, but like basically Freud and Marx hang over Walter's work with profound importance, and I would say that would be what I would say is the most important thing about his work is bringing those deep insights to bear on understanding history and literature.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bobby, do you want to add anything to the question?
I would just say, I think for me, one thing that was profoundly important was Walter always knew who he was writing to and why he was writing to them. And for me, that was important because I have never been a pure academic. I was always going to be a pastor with a scholarly mind or a scholar with a pastor's heart. And I found that really hard to balance, especially coming through graduate school. And I remember I had a book in me that was a pastor book. And I felt like I couldn't write it because it wasn't academic enough. And I called Walter and I said, Walter, I'm really struggling here. And he said, Bobby, you got to write what's in your heart. You know, you're going to take your lumps from the academy maybe, and Walter took a lot of lumps in the academy.
Yes.
But his clarity about, I'm writing to pastors, and he would come out at these preaching conferences and say to pastors, you have the hardest job in the world, and you need, like, I'm trying to give you strength for the work that you're doing, and what you're doing is changing the world. And his gratitude for pastors and his, like, aiming his work toward the pastoral ministry. And so that was a real, instead of the hard men of biblical scholarship. And that was helpful to me, just sort of by way of release. One other thing is just, Brennan was talking about his theology of the Old Testament, and he has this line, probably the most controversial line in his theology of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament, as such, exists in, with, and under the text, and nowhere else, and in no other way. And people have argued about that line for 30 years. And I struggled so much with it, and because was he saying God doesn't exist outside? What's he saying? And I finally, when I was writing this book, just like last week, I finally realized in, with, and under. That's the language of real presence in the doctrine of communion. And what Walter has been saying all this time is when you read the text, God is there in the way that Jesus is present in communion. You can look at it and think, nope, they're just drinking juice. Or you can, and so that to me, so instead of trying to prove or defend that God is really somewhere, just like, no, it's there in the text. And so that has been very freeing for me.
Thank you. Kathleen, do you want to add any last thoughts?
No, I have no last thoughts.
No last thoughts. So of all Walter's books, and I'll just let somebody jump in if they'd like, which in your library is the most worn, dog-eared, and underlined? What about that book keeps you coming back to it?
I fear that Walter would come get me if I let his books get dog-eared. So I keep them I don't know how many times I've read these, but they are very pristine. I'll just stop there, yeah.
Who'd like to start?
I would just say The Message of the Psalms, 1983. I didn't bring it here because pages would have fallen out between my office and here. It's just so beat up, so well used. But just very briefly, orientation, disorientation, reorientation. That's life, enough said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to follow if you're talking about Psalms. So when seniors come to me and say, what are the books I should get? I say, when it comes to Psalms, there are 2 books. These are the 2 books you must purchase. One is by a little-known scholar. It's called Seeing the Psalms. It's by Bill Brown. So one book is, that didn't go over so well. One book, Seeing the Psalms by Bill Brown. The other book you must get is The Psalms of Life and Faith by Walter Brueggemann. And the reason is because of the costly loss of lament. So before the pandemic, this beautiful essay that involves psychological analysis that talks about the function of lament in our relationship with God. And if we can't lament, we don't have a mature relationship with God. That'll preach all day and every day. Yeah.
I think I've taught the prophetic imagination most of any of the works, but probably the theology of the Old Testament is the one I've come back to as the most robust framework for how Walter thinks about, and part of it has to do with this line and how do we think about theology when we're sort of restricting ourselves to the text and trying not to make claims that just get us into trouble because we get too speculative and about God beyond the text. So how do we just talk? So he's kind of he was big ideas, but he was also very careful and constrained in some ways in what he would speak to or wouldn't speak to, and it didn't always fit along the lines of other people were drawing, but he drew his own in a careful way, and so I think the big theology of the Old Testament is probably the one I've returned to the most.
And like his chapter in there on like the history of the field,
Yeah.
and the history of theology of the Old Testament,
Yeah.
hugely important, and like shows that he didn't just like ignore the past. He deeply like drank from the well of biblical scholarship, but wasn't quite satisfied with what he found. Yeah, but I mean, like he used to bring like pictures of like biblical scholars to your classes and stuff,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, like pass them around.
I have a number of them. They don't work as well anymore. The youth of today. They're enamored with Gunkel.
Kathleen or Bob?
Yeah, well, I have a slightly counter-narrative.
That's good.
I found if I read a lot of Walter, I never had a thought of my own. So I had to spend some time protecting myself.
Yeah.
So, not myself, the possibility that I might have an idea one day. And so I would say that I didn't read his books and hold them that way. I'd try to do my own work and then read his books because I couldn't think of an original thought if I didn't. So,
Yeah.
I think for me, the book that has been most important, at least especially recently, is, I don't know if it's one of his better known books, but it's a 2014 book called Money and Possessions.
Oh, yeah.
It came out in the Interpretation series. And he goes in that book from the Torah of Moses through Revelation, and he talks about the way the biblical text views money and possessions. And the sort of orienting framework is Jesus, saying in Matthew, you cannot serve both God and wealth. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, what you will eat or what you will drink. And that idea just keeps coming back to me in almost every text I read these days, but that, love of God means love of neighbor, which means what you do with your money and possessions. And so that has, the way he framed it in that book has been really helpful to me.
Thank you. This question is for Judy, Brennan, and Bill. And I think we'll start with Brennan. How do you see Walter's work informing the present and future of biblical scholarship and preaching? It's a little question.
Yeah. I mean, in so many ways, but let me just, I'll pick one that came to mind. So I'm interested in reception history. So I mean, I like historical critical work with the Bible. I like thinking about ancient authors and what meanings of text would have been in the ancient period. But I've always been interested in more than that too. And in part it's because when I started reading Walter's work, I mean, he's talking about East of Eden in here. He's talking to John Steinbeck. He's like thinking about the modern contemporary, or in that day what would have been modern folks. He's thinking about like novels. He's thinking about like artworks. He's thinking, he really is trying to kind of think about how contemporary folks are receiving and understanding the text. And he's thinking about the application of it in the church. And so for me, I was trying to figure out, how do I do this kind of stuff? How do I get a PhD doing what Walter would do? Because honestly, a lot of places wouldn't give you a PhD for doing what Walter would do. I mean, honestly, most PhD programs want you to do the historical critical kind of thing, to get your degree and so on. And so I'm at Emory. I'm interested in thinking about the Bible and contemporary issues of faith, and one of the things that people started talking about was reception history. So that is the history of how people have understood the Bible, and how do you study this, academically and so on. But for me, it was really like a way to try to do what Walter was doing, and get a PhD doing it. And so I do think that Walter really is someone whose work has deeply informed the whole field of reception history, but in ways that people don't want to talk about because it's too confessional or it's too for the church. But a lot of people got interested in what the kind of interbiblical. He's part of the whole interbiblical biblical dialogue. Kind of the Bible talks to itself, and people are responding to other people over the course of biblical history. The New Testament is responding in many ways to these claims of the Old Testament, and then the early church is responding, and he usually traces things out into the early church and then traces them out in sometimes the medieval church and then the modern church, and talks about biblical scholarship. And in a way, he's doing reception history, and it's never been named for that. But I do think that in a way, my whole subdiscipline owes a lot to him and his work.
All right. Yeah, so Alfred North Whitehead once said,
Oh,
Ready?
yeah, as we were saying the other day, right?
that's right, quote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Since the 1990s, at least, one could say that most of Old Testament scholarship that has been at all concerned with the issues beyond the mere historical, beyond the mere philological, has consisted of a series of footnotes to Walter Brueggemann's
Oh,
work.
that's nice, nice.
And I think it will continue to be the case in the foreseeable future. Again, as said and emphasized so often, his intellect, his integrative intellect, his breadth, staggering breadth of interdisciplinary work and canonical breadth. He's said about just everything about everything in the Bible, which means that all of us who want to do something in Bible, we have to go back to Walter and see what he said. Whether we write our stuff first and then look him up, or we start at the beginning.
recommend that.
Yeah, I do too, yeah. But he was such a trailblazer in opening up the ancient scriptures to the postmodern world. In short, he put Old Testament studies on the map of American culture and politics. But I think what one of Walter's lasting legacies for me and for the discipline is that he sort of drove the final nail in the coffin of disinterested objectivity.
Yes, he did.
Hallelujah.
Walter brought pathos and imagination to biblical studies like the fire in Jeremiah's bow.
Yeah, guys, that's it.
And he paved the way for biblical scholars, like he did for preachers, to be artistic in how they communicate their work. Not only to be theologically persuasive, but also aesthetically compelling. I mean, his words are poetic. There's a passion behind these words that just make them particularly persuasive and compelling. And his example also teaches the rest of us to be honest about ourselves, transparent about our contexts, and to come clean in our commitments to the ideals of justice, equity, and inclusion. If I can say that here, I think I can. Or to put it negatively, Walter's work has made it impossible to do biblical studies without a passionate concern for people in pain, without concern for justice and freedom, without concern for creation and travail, without concern for life in extremis. One of his refrains in his book, in extremis.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, so, and he had a knack for keeping the big picture always in view, as mentioned before. That is to say, what Walter did was he did more than put the so what back in biblical studies. He put the prophetic therefore in biblical studies, the one-word bridge that connects the indictment with the judgment, as well as blessing and action, the therefore of imagining and making, of acting and doing. Walter's exegesis is both agile and action-oriented. And that action began with imagination. And so I'm also grateful for his championing imagination when it comes to exegesis. Yeah. And he was doing public theology before it was a thing.
Yeah.
And doing it biblically.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I had a moment this past week when it occurred to me, I am teaching the Old Testament outside of Washington, D.C. in 2025. And I had a student say, well, I want to say this, and it's not political. And I said, stop. So here's what I want to say about Walter Brueggemann. We are teaching Bible in this day, and we cannot afford to be disassociated or dispassionate.
Yeah.
That is not an option for us anymore.
Yeah.
And it seems to me what Walter Brueggemann has done, and I'm going to pause and say embodiment matters. So what Walter Brueggemann did as a white man with a German name, right? Because this matters. Jim Wallace says, Walter and I were doing things that black preachers were doing, but no one was listening to the black preachers. Embodiment matters. He stood in a place where he didn't have to stand and say these things. So it seems to me that our job, our role as teachers, is to raise up Christians and faith leaders who actually read the Bible, Walter read the Bible closely, with critical eyes. He engaged the text often in its own terms, on its own terms. He, in my mind, was very much a dialogic reader of Scripture and gave testimony to the way that Scripture is becoming, that it comes from a people that are becoming, that Israel's identity grows and changes over time, their understanding of who God is changes over time. And he did all of that with this literary eye, which allows for nuance and subtlety and patterns and repetition, and all of that with this theological eye. So when I think about what Bakhtin talks about as this characteristic of unfinalizability, there's something about Walter's work that is just laying that open. Here it is, and it's going to keep going. So this is a gift he's given to us, for which I am most grateful.
So friends, I'm looking at our time, and we fortuitously have a little bit of time to open it up for comments or questions before I ask a last question. That is the panel will have a few last words. But before I ask the last question, perhaps you have questions or comments you'd like to ask, either the whole panel or a member thereof. You can absolutely make comments about Walter.
As a pastor, remembering the things he taught us, they just simply pay attention to the verbs, pay attention to the repetition, pay attention to the vibes.
Yeah.
When I enter an Old Testament text, it's the first thing I do. Second thing is, he talked about historical critical stuff. I remember we were writing a paper and kind of asking a question about how much to spend time on the historical critical. He says, oh, you got to know all that stuff. It needs to be in the background, but I don't want to see it in the paper.
Right.
And that was very informative. He expected us to do the work to understand and then go from there. And that's always been, that's very, 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 very informative to me for preaching, that historical critical needs to be a foundation, but that's not what you bring to the pulpit. And that was very helpful. On a personal note, we got to go to China, Lee Carroll and most of us in Florida. Others went to China with Walter, and the day before, he was doing some yard work, which I think was kind of unusual. And he got halfway to China, he broke out in poison ivy.
Oh, no.
It was a terrible case. And when he went to Hong Kong, and they gave him some ointment, which made it twice as bad. Then he got some medication, which helped to relieve the pain. And so we were in these very hot rooms in China with hot tea, and Walter being back to sweating. Walter being back to sweating from it. He was Joe for 2 weeks. And but he handled it, didn't complain one time, but you could see it all over his face. It was tough. The last thing I'll say is personal. Is that two personal things. I invited him to teach at my home church on Wednesday night. He came to Wednesday night supper. He taught. He engaged the group. The oxygen left the room. And the next morning when I got to campus for Marietta at 8 o'clock in the morning, there was a handwritten note thanking me for inviting him to come to church. Yeah. And then some years later, my dad was on staff here and had a heart attack and remembers. I was talking to Dad today about this, and he remembers the very thoughtful, intentional handwritten note from Walter after his heart attack. And that was the pastoral side of Walter that most of his readers may not have seen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Please.
Yes, so most of you talked about, your favorite works by Dr. Brueggemann and things that you agree with. I just wanted to ask the panel, was there anything that he wrote on or anything that you disagreed with?
I'm the only one here. The subject of the abusing God was the clarifying thing for me, and he was insistent all the time that the text said that, and that was who God was, and and I wanted that not to be so. I couldn't bear that, and then there was one other thing, which I better dare not say in a Presbyterian seminary. The sovereignty of God was his primary theological landing place, and by which I believe Presbyterians mean the freedom of God. And I'm for that, but I do not in any way think it's the central way of talking about God from biblical texts. And so that's something we chatted about and struggled with, and I have no alternative to offer you, except maybe the presence of God, or the existence of God, the very being of God. But I have nothing more to say. I'm an Old Testament scholar, not a theologian. I'm stopping, and I've been retired a long time and not thinking about this very much, but I do. Well, there were a lot of things.
Anybody else want to say something?
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. I thought I was going to be dragged out of here.
So I've had problems with that too. Yeah. In fact, your book, the Tears of Lamentation, or the Tears of the World, your study on lamentation, I consider it to be a response in a way
It was, yeah, it sort of was.
to Walter's
Yeah.
work on the.
But it started with his work, you know, the lamentation, like Judy's already said, about if we're not weeping, we're not alive. And he made that so clear in his study of Protestant churches and how the texts of lament hardly get used, and I thought, well, as a Catholic, I'm going to find that to be completely different, and it was not completely different. I thought having in the liturgy of the hours, lamentations are front and center, but in ordinary Sunday lectionary, no. And it's still a critique of the culture. That's what he did, though. That's the biggest thing he did, was see that as a critique of our culture. And so then suppose we thought about right now, suppose everybody who was injured as a child had wept about that, where would we be? A simplification, I might add, but still.
I have one.
Oh, great.
Did I interrupt?
No, please.
This is my favorite commentary, except for this. Genesis 38. This peculiar chapter stands alone, without connection to its context. It is isolated in every way and is most enigmatic, does not seem to belong with any of the identified sources of ancestral tradition. It is not evident that it provides any significant theological resource. Now listen, it's all right for him to have a bad moment, right? So that would be the one thing, yeah. Genesis 38, Tamar and Judah. So you have that first chapter in the Joseph narrative. Joseph gets sold away. What's going to happen to Joseph? And then we switch, and we go to Tamar, and then we go back to Joseph. But because he has such a good literary eye, it hurt me that he couldn't.
Well, he grew into his feminism, though, too. You have to add that.
I think for some of us as wisdom literature scholars, he was never terribly enamored with wisdom literature.
That's true.
And wasn't fully convinced that it had a really important place. And for all of, like almost all of us at the table, like do a lot of wisdom literature here. So we think we're filling gaps.
But it doesn't matter.
What's pretty ironic, though, and maybe Bobby can speak to this as well, is that one of his earliest books was about the wisdom literature.
That's right.
In Man We Trust.
Yeah.
And I've always had the sense that Walter, over the years, was embarrassed by that book. Or he really didn't. He acted like he never wrote it.
The story.
20 books, so it would be okay if you let one go, yes.
The story that he told me about that book is he called it In Man We Trust. And Phyllis Tribble said, Walter, you cannot publish a book called In Man We Trust. And she was right. Yeah. And he published it anyway. Yeah. And I think he really did feel that. That he regretted that he had not had the foresight to call that book something else.
So in 1992, at an SBL meeting, I forget where, I remember Walter and this young scholar from Jamaica in the same room. And this young scholar from Jamaica, I think it was his first SBL presentation, he stood up and read a paper that severely critiqued Walter's take on creation theology in the Bible. And Walter had written this essay about the place of creation theology in Old Testament studies. And he was never a fan of creation theology. And his name was J. Richard Middleton. And he said, from his context, Genesis 1 is a very liberative text. And you can even see that in the context of the exile. And so this was not planned. So when he sat down, and there may have been a couple other papers after that, there was some time left over. And so the moderator, in a stroke of brilliance, asked Walter if he would be open to giving a response to Middleton's paper. So Walter got up, he went over to the podium, and as we all waited with bated breath, he basically said that Middleton was right. And he said this, sort of as a confession, he said, all my work, all my writing so far has been ad hoc. Contextual, provisional, ad hoc. And he conceded Richard's point, and you can read about the conversation in a more codified form in the Harvard Theological Review in 1994. And it really is a fascinating dialogue, which, I think Walter was a little more conceding in person. When you read his article, there's a little more of a defense of his stance. But that's just the way scholarship works. And so I was so impressed of his willingness to accept criticism. He took it as constructive, and he learned from it, and he continued to improvise, and to revise, and to learn, and to adapt. That is the mark of a great scholar.
I agree.
Thank you. Thank you for a very generative question. Please. Oh, I think there's microphone coming up.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. What a wonderful event this is. So I'm thinking a lot about the legacy of Brueggemann, and what I hear a lot of you gesturing towards is just this incredible capacity to be so seriously engaged with biblical scholarship at a very rigorous and deep level, and also seriously engaged with the life of the church and writing for, I discovered Brueggemann as a high schooler with no theological training. Sabbath as Resistance somehow found its way into my hands.
Wow.
And in many ways, that is probably what led me to pursuing biblical studies. But he wrote in a way that I could access what he had to share, which is a very special thing.
Yes.
And I hear some of you also gesturing, that's not really something that you're taught necessarily. You go to get a PhD in biblical studies, you're not taught how to communicate and condense this kind of wisdom and knowledge and theology into something that you can hand to the church. So thinking about Brueggemann's legacy and maybe the next generation and the generation after that of biblical scholarship, what can we be doing as theological educators or as practicing ministers to create space for the cultivation of new, young, emerging voices that can do what Brueggemann did, but in new ways, engage with scholarship seriously, but also give those good gifts to the people who need them?
I think that was very thoughtful comment, and I thank you for it. And what I think biblical scholars and all human beings should do is avoid jargon, which is specialized vocabulary that works in your community but works nowhere else.
That's right.
And it's terrible.
That's right.
It's interesting because there's really two sides of being a biblical scholar, right? One is contributing to the knowledge of the guild, which matters. And when you are contributing to the knowledge of the guild, you have to speak in conversation with all the other scholars and using the technical language. And that's how the guild advances and thinks thoughts it has not thought before. And so it's important, it matters. But it's not the kind of thing that most church people will pick up and read. And so scholars also need to be able to translate into the vernacular. And it is hard to be somebody who can do both of those things.
Yes.
And Walter could do it
He could do both.
in a way that not just anybody can do it. And so I go back and forth between whether every academic needs to be able to write public theology or whether what we need is academics who are committed to public theology and that is valued by both the academy and the church. And then there are other people who say, great, good for you, but I'm digging deep in the technical stuff, and that's important too.
It's a great question, and I think making spaces in PhD programs for that kind of thing, like for those folks, and also thinking about like publication outlets and things like that to help people speak in these ways that are helpful to the church. Walter published a lot in things like Theology Today and in things like, some of these journals and organs are not doing very well these days, and so creative ways to try to connect people who want to do this work and the people who desperately need it. I think there's some growth that needs to happen there.
So this is a somewhat unformed thought. There's something inherent in the academy that's about exclusivity.
Yes.
Right? Like, not everyone can get there. Not everyone decides they want to do a PhD in Bible early enough to do the language so they can be considered.
Yes.
So there's a way in which this is a tricky thing. We talk about the guild. There's tenure. There are levels, right? It's like, getting to the highest level of heaven. And so I think this is a part of the culture that formed everyone here. And I think it's important to name that. PhD programs many are accepting fewer and fewer people. It is a highly prized thing. There is specialized language and languages. And so this is important. It's important because it says a lot about who we are if the best of what we have can only be shared with a few people. And how do we navigate this? It's a question I think we all wrestle with, we all live with. And it is also the case, if we look at Walter Brueggemann's life, there were many scholars who criticized him because of that.
That's right.
So that's the other piece, right? We're all saying, yay, yay, Walter Brueggemann. Walter Brueggemann often was dismissed by people who were not nearly as smart as he was.
That's right.
Right?
Joe.
Yes. I did, yes.
I pre-ordered on Amazon.
Thank you, brother. As should you all.
Reading the Bible with Brueggemann, right?
That's it.
Yes.
First of all, Old Testament scholars do more before 9 a.m. than most people do all day. So we adapt the Marines. Sorry, Mitzi, Professor Mitzi. Yes, ma'am. I'm in my 50s. I was in my 40s before I really understood that the Bible and Jesus and Christianity has a critique of capitalism. Brueggemann has been telling us that. We haven't heard it from the Bible, we haven't heard it from Jesus, and we didn't hear it from Walter. Thoughts about that? Small question.
Yeah.
Wait, I missed the last part. You said we did not hear it from Walter?
Right.
Why hasn't it broken through?
Oh, why hasn't it broken through? That's a great, that's the question,
Would you repeat
right?
the question? Would you repeat the question? I'm hard of hearing, and I didn't hear the question, and it sounds like it's...
Bible,
Yeah.
prophets,
Yeah.
Jesus, James 5, brutal.
Moses?
I've never heard James 5 preach till I preached.
Oh.
James 5:6. Look it up. So we have drowned the Bible with capitalism. Walter kept trying to tell us materialism is a problem. Materiality is an issue. We are praising him. He's formed decades and decades of people. I dare say we keep leaving that part out. So, Bobby, you tell us why. How can we fix it?
I feel like Walter was so insistent about that, and but it's a hard, like if you take seriously what Deuteronomy 15 says, every 7th year you should forgive all debts. Are you kidding me right now? Like, what? How do you, and so I mean, you know, we are all, I mean, I'll speak for myself, invested. Like, I've got money. I'm a tenured professor at a good institution, like, and Walter was too. And so our investment in the system is real, and trying to figure out how do you undercut the system to which we are all indebted, enamored, it's a really hard question. And I haven't figured that out in my own life. And Walter makes some suggestions in Materiality as Resistance about here's some things you can do, and it's pretty good, but it's a hard, in the churches that I'm a part of, well, not in my homeless church, it works there, but in my other churches, like, it's a hard sell to get people to take the Jubilee year seriously. So I don't know if anybody's got it figured out. Like, let us know.
We're not even sure that they kept the Jubilee in the historical times, but the fact that it exists as a goal or an ideal is an extraordinary gift to us, I think.
Yeah.
As a matter
So I mean, there are a whole bunch of texts to read. So the church needs to read them. That's my simplistic answer.
To read the text.
Or go to a church that does.
Yeah, go to my church. I'll talk to you afterwards.
I'm surprised that we haven't heard the word empire tonight
good point.
With Walter. The book that touched me so deeply was Doxology Against Idolatry. And I think of that in the weekly worship, how that becomes a North Star once you see that as a movement of resistance for the community. But I also, when you were talking about Walter, I was thinking, you know, both he and Martin Marty grew up as children of the manse.
Yeah.
And this, you know, incredible scholarship and unbelievable output, and yet it really was for the upbuilding of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, you know, how do we nurture scholars who came out of that particular place and time, in that we have a new place and time, and yet to give thanks for that amazing witness of the church and the gift to the church from those people, and you know, you all trying to do that now. Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask the last question. We're just about at our hour. The last question I wanted the panelists to think about was the following. For Walter here this evening, surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, and those who are joining us via live stream, for what would you want to thank him? And we can go in whatever order.
Well, I'll start then. I think for his love of the Bible, his love of the earth, human beings, and his the way he expressed that with me with his time. I said I was able gratefully to give remarks at his service, and I talked about how I met him. He was 69 years old, retiring in May at 70 after his March birthday, and so he had one foot out the door, and I ended up having this incredible relationship with him. All of it happened after he retired, and the output of books. I mean, he had plenty of books to write. We see that, right? But he also just took so much time to care for people and to help younger scholars and anybody, I think, that he could. And so I think his sort of love and how that manifested itself in his gift of the time. Yeah.
One thing we didn't talk about, I think you asked me to and I forgot, about his contribution to Columbia Seminary. Columbia Seminary was for a long time an important Presbyterian seminary. He put it on the world map. He did. And it became a place of great importance because of him. I think that his contributions were enormous to theological life, and I think the thing I'd want to thank him for is for being himself despite the attacks on him. And I think we are at a very different time, and learning is different scholarship is different, questions are different, but I think it's his spirit that inspires me to think about hope for the future. That's what I would say.
The thing that struck me, his courage, like to, yeah, and so this is building on what Kathleen said, his being himself. But yeah, his courage to say things that were pretty unpopular and just put them in print and take the hits for him. I hope I can do things like that someday, or even close to that. Yeah, he was willing to say things that were going to get him flack all the time. And even just standing up in SBL and saying, I remember one time he presented, he said something, this is like in like a, I think it was like not like a preaching section, it was like Germanic history or something, and he just said, I primarily work for preachers. He's like looking at these biblical scholars, I primarily work for preachers, this is what I'm doing. I remember, I loved it, but at the same time I was just thinking, gosh, he's gonna get yelled at. Yeah. So.
I would thank Walter for his discipline. For all these books and articles and prayers, even the ones he wasn't crazy about later on, we have this treasure that continues to speak to us.
Thank you.
I had the great good fortune of working on a book. It took me a very long time to write because I was working through a lot of trying to understand what Walter had given me. And that book went to Walter to write the foreword, and he read it. And then he said to me that it was, he said, you understood me so well, which was such a gift to me. Mm-hmm. And then he called me or emailed me maybe in February of last year and told me he was going on palliative care and that he wasn't sure if he would see the book come out. And so I wrote the acknowledgments to the book on his birthday in March. And so I got a chance to say to Walter what I wanted to say to him. And what I said was essentially, he always liked to say, speech leads reality. And I never knew what that meant. And then I realized one day that when I was a first-year seminary student here, at the end of that semester, where the modernity was melting your brain, he invited me out to Sweet Melissa's on the square in Decatur, and he said, Bobby, you need to go to graduate school and do your PhD. And that had never occurred to me, that would be me. And so honestly, the way I think about it is my whole life that has unfolded since that conversation is a gift from Walter. Like I have this beautiful life that I have loved, and so I said to Walter, like I never would have lived this life without what you said to me that day. So I'm grateful for that.
I can't match that, but I do have one very personal thanks to give to Walter. Thank you, Walter, for giving up your office.
All that space for books.
And not just giving up your office, but moving down the hallway to inhabit a much smaller office on the third floor of Richards Center. And to thank you for your grace and hospitality for what you showed me during my first 2 years at Columbia Seminary. And I want to say I hereby promise to do the same when we welcome 2 new Old Testament colleagues here at Columbia starting next week. But also in gratitude, I'd like to offer a poem from someone, me, who is not a poet. But you have challenged us all to be poets. But I don't think this is the kind of poetry you had in mind, so be it. When biblical studies was obsessed with historical critical navel-gazing, finally came the poet, bringing his prophetic word ablazing. You came with boldness and audacity, to proclaim the God of tenacious solidarity. And you did so not without a degree of humor and hilarity.
Keep your day job.
Like I said. I'm not quite done. You brought biting wit, lyrical flair, and daring speech to the interpreter's table, inviting us all to sit with you as we were able. Your mission in part was to dismantle dominant ideologies and break the banality of bad theologies, to confront every theology that kills and controls while offering a biblical framework that liberates and consoles. You have shown, for example, that a theology that consists only in praise tends to silence the voices of sorrow and pain. Indeed, you have shown that true doxology can only be secured through the gauntlet of lament and the self fully surrendered. You have shown that the God of abundance is never redundant in a time when our culture is ever so consumptive. Like Elijah, you have been a troubler, a thorn in Ahab's side, a troubler of any power that governs in fear and in lies. The prophets and the psalmists, you taught us, began with the anguished cry and invoked the God who disrupts, renews, and always takes sides. The God who takes the side of the orphan and the widow, who lifts up the lowly and sends the princes packing and belittled. You taught us preachers to be subtle and surprising, not assaultive, judgmental, indignant, or conniving, but faithful and playful, poetic and empowering. Oh, Walter, how you wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, driven not by a spirit of madness, but with the spirit inspired by divine pathos. Indeed, you were compelled, like Abraham Heschel, by God's unwavering, tenacious chesed.
That's great. That's great.
Walter, you set forth the Bible's dialogical potential, revealing the scriptures to be tremendously consequential. You modeled a pedagogy laced with provocative glee, unleashing the God of the Bible as untamably free, while practicing a ministry of justice and grace, always with an awareness of contextualized space. Oh, Walter, you made the prophets proud and the psalmists thankful, and we who are left inspired to be ever so impactful. Thank you, dear colleague, for all that you've written, for all that you have taught and inspired and mentored, for all your books and for all your prayers, for all your laughter and everything you've shared. Thank you, dear colleague in Christ of the cross, servant of the church for the marginalized and the lost, mentor to all in this ministry of great cost. So, dear Walter, you have put down the pen and the dictational device. May you enjoy your eternal Sabbath with some lemonade on ice. And while you may still be restless with the yearning to write, now it's the angels who will be reading with delight. So as you enjoy your time with Colbart and Funrod, may we continue the work that is most wondrous and odd.
So friends, thank you all so very much. We do have a reception, of course. It's down the hall. Rhonda, are we ready? We're not ready. Okay, so let's talk amongst ourselves. Before we break into conversation, please join me in expressing gratitude to our panelists.
What's the name of the woman next to Jen?
I'm Henry. He's here.
Yes, Walter. Let's hear for Walter. I'm sorry for my outburst.
This is what I needed.